In a universe that almost is, just out of reach beyond the edge of reality, mysterious forces underlie the fabric of existence. Energemetry 6, the very energy of creation, serves as both the elixir of life and the arsenal of destruction for its human and not-so-human denizens.
Crushing darkness, whose source they cannot fathom, grips the cosmos and its people. In anguish, they dream of the long-foretold bright star.
Join us as we embark on an epic journey, exploring the universe of Energemetry 6.
And it looks like we are correctly live everywhere we should be, finally, this time. So they did fix their custom feeds, which is also good. Even though I couldn't quite get it to work the first time, we did at least make it work this time. So welcome everybody. This is the Energemetry 6 podcast. This is episode 24. We are here getting started on the Veil of Mysteries. We have Luke for Andrew. Mel's going to be reading Laura. I have second and third here doing their different characters as well. And I appreciate everybody being here. So, with it actually working correctly this time, I don't know. This has been a day for it, I tell you. Our refrigerator died this morning. I came out and I went to pour myself milk and there's yogurt in the milk jug, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. So, you know, one of those sorts of
Never
days.
a good way to start the day.
Yeah, one of those days. Anyhow, thank you everybody for being here. Let's go ahead and hit the value for value ad real fast and then we'll get going. The Energemetry 6 podcast operates on a value-for-value model. That means that we hope if we provide some value to you in your life, that you'll return that to us in whatever way you can manage. If you're interested, head over to e6universe.com and sign up for our email list to get our free ebooks and hopefully buy a physical book or some merch while you're there. Or if all you can manage right now is to leave us a good review somewhere, 5 stars or some kind of positive rating, that's more than appreciated. Thank you. And with that, this is the Veil of Mysteries that we're starting. This is I don't even have a label for what this is. This is the very beginning of the book. You would call it a cold start, I guess, or yeah. So The Veil of Mysteries by me, Jared Michaud. The vessel Hope hung in the void. Once she had been Earth's greatest achievement, created during the most difficult time in man's history to carry a few thousand brave souls to the stars. She was conceived as a modern-day ark, built to save humanity from a world consumed by a deluge of madness. Her builders were the most accomplished geniuses of their generation, men driven to their absolute best by a world bent on their destruction. Their sole aim was the salvation of those they loved. They invented completely new scientific disciplines in their pursuit, and did it all in complete secrecy. All the while, their opponent, the most powerful tyrant in the history of their world, hunted them relentlessly with the most advanced tools his age had to offer. Hope's construction concluded with the most desperate first flight in the history of astronautics, proving once and for all her inventor's competence and dedication. She escaped, the sole survivor of their small fleet. That battle had left its marks upon her hull, but by the Lightmaker's grace she prevailed, carrying her precious cargo to a new home in what they thought was an entirely different universe from their own. The ages since had passed with an unrelenting metronome pace, while Hope languished. The light of the remote sun around which she orbited shone with unwavering brilliance upon the impossible dust cloud that protected the entire star system. 3,000 years had come and gone, as her creators would have reckoned it. Still she circled, all but forgotten, through the least frequented solar system in her new galaxy. In the time that followed the escape, Hope's name once again gained new meaning, even as she aged into senescence, for she had become home to the Guardian of the Remnant, the universe's most powerful energemetrist. Hope was the Guardian's sanctum, and when he disappeared, he left within her objects so powerful the galaxy would have braved even the veil of mysteries that protected her to gain them, had they known. They had not known, however, and the departed master's gift remained undisturbed, as did Hope's other passenger, the passenger that even the master had not understood when he found it. He had been far too powerful then, too well disciplined for it to show its true nature. He, after all, might have found a way to destroy it, or to hide it forever. So it had remained quiescent, waiting. If Hope had truly been as alive and intelligent as her once passengers fondly imagined, she might have felt the darkness at her heart. But she didn't. Heedless of the passage of time, she carried her cargo through the void, waiting for the one called Bright Star. Prologue. It felt like being stuck in sucking mud inside his own mind. Every time he tried to shift his attention, to pull free, he was wrenched back into dull blankness. He swam in a lake of soft, heavy darkness, drowning in it, and he couldn't get his head above water no matter how hard he tried. He fought it as best he could, pulling himself toward clarity, over and over, as the weight of his own consciousness sucked him back. It took hours, he thought. Or maybe it was days. Or only seconds. Whatever the vision's timescale might have been, his mind slowly, ever so slowly, began to clear. Even from the beginning, he knew somehow that he wasn't awake. It was like a dream that wouldn't release him, but at the same time, it was too real. He was thinking clearly enough to know he wasn't awake. That was something. It had taken what felt like an age for him to remember his name, or that he had a name. It was still dreamlike enough that the next thought came very slowly. He was Nate, but where was he? Why was he here? The darkness pressed in upon him, and at first he was afraid. He knew somehow, instinctively, that pain was waiting for him. At first he shied away. Hadn't he had enough pain? But his resolve strengthened. This wouldn't be like before. He could barely remember what before was, but he would not run away. Never again. He focused, pushed himself forward. After a time, when he focused as hard as he could, he saw something. The view came in pulses, and there was a blinding pain with each wave. If he could have gritted his teeth, he would have, but this dream wouldn't allow it. Through the pain, he saw a boy beating his head relentlessly against a wall, hands clenched over his ears. Each smack of the boy's head assaulted Nate with a new wave of pain. The familiarity of the scene was eerie. He didn't know what it meant, but he should. He should know. The feeling was so deep that he couldn't doubt or question. It left him with a sinking sensation in the pit of his stomach, and in that moment he didn't know why. As he watched, bewildered, the boy stopped hammering his head against the wall and looked up, eyes pleading. Those eyes were familiar. Who was this poor, wretched boy? What was he doing here? Then he remembered, and the sick feeling in the pit of his belly blossomed into full life. He remembered who he was, and seeing himself from the outside, he felt pity. Not self-pity, exactly, but the pity he would have felt for another in his own place. He was truly a wretched human being. He reached out to offer succor. Anything had to be better than this. As he reached, what he saw was almost like a reflection on water. The boy's arm came up, reaching out toward him. It was like looking at himself. Then it dawned on him. There was no one here but him. It was then the duality of his current state cleared, and he remembered what it was like to sit on the floor, rocking, unable to focus, thoughts jumbled. He found himself weeping helplessly, hopelessly. There was nothing but tragedy here. He was seeing himself as others must, and it was unbearable. What was a wreck like him good for? There was no question that it was his own memory, but now that he remembered it, he wished he hadn't. The pain and despair almost drove him away again into the darkness. Almost. In that, his moment of greatest despair, he was buoyed up by a strength greater than his own. It was peace and certainty, and as the boy before him, the vision of himself came clearer, Nate did not shrink from it. Then he saw something new. He was on a beach and there were footprints in the sand. The footprints led away far into the distance, and for the first time he felt a stirring of hope. Those footprints marked the path he must follow, and so he rose and stepped out into a new world. Part 1. Sanctuary. Interval. Elder Neil Eden, journal entry, 6/4/1033 NST. Luke, you want to read this?
I'm not an evil man, am I? I don't know who Rebus is getting his instructions from. He won't tell me. At first, I would never have thought an Elder of Sanctuary capable of what he's doing. And now I'm in too deep to back out. If only I'd seen this coming before I took his credits. In my defense, I was going to vote yes on his motion even without the bribe. It just made life easier. My father would be ashamed. Granddad would space me. If the others ever find out, our reputation will never recover. We might as well be Raddings?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We might as well be Raddings. Of course, I might have gotten free of him if I had the sense to confess to the rest of the council before the second time. Voids. Right out the airlock, and I deserve it too. I don't know what he's going to do to this boy, the one they call Brightstar. But I saw the look in his eye. Whatever he does, I want no part of it. None. I'd run, I think, if not for the veil. Who would have ever thought I could look at our great protection as a curse?
The Veil of Mysteries, Chapter 1. Mel, you want to hit the quote there? Oh, no, actually, it's Trevor Gorman. Luke, you do the quote.
Ha! You could be wandering around in that soup until the heat death of the universe. Or until you die, whichever comes first. Suppose that has to happen someday, even to a freak like you.
Trevor Gorman, Deceiver Ratting, attributed before Ratting pierced the Veil of Mysteries, year 653 NST. The gyrating mass of interstellar dust and gas was beautiful in an otherworldly sort of way. The cloud's dim, ruddy color made the slow swirling of the surface seem like a mirage. The murky, billowing nebula was so vast that it should have taken millennia for the surface of the cloud to move at all. Still, as they watched, the surface seemed to shift ever so slightly, and the whirls and wisps that made up its texture were subtly different. It was mesmerizing in a subtle way, and Nate, called Brightstar, found himself lost in its patterns, wondering what caused them. He contemplated the cloud calmly, studying the dimly visible stars toward the edge of the mass and the deeper darkness directly in front of Adamant, the tiny vessel in which Nate was a passenger. Ty Wrighton stuck his head through the bridge hatchway, breaking Nate's reverie with an odd question.
What's that?
Okay, you don't need to yell. Try that again without yelling.
What's that?
From his seat across the bridge, Kevin Ratting chuckled merrily. It's the Veil of Mysteries, of course. Ty snorted, giving Kevin an irritated look.
I thought you said it was a rainbow.
You gotta speak into the mic.
I thought you said it was a rainbow.
Kevin groaned. It's Sanctuary. Inside. Shannon Logan, one of the three siblings to whom Adamant belonged and their current pilot, cleared her throat noisily, interrupting the byplay.
We still don't have a way in, unless you've thought of something new.
She eyed Kevin balefully, as if they were stuck there, staring at the incomprehensibly large, impossibly dense mass of dust and gas, because something... She eyed Kevin balefully, as if they were stuck there, staring at the incomprehensibly large, impossibly dense mass of dust and gas, because of something he was holding back. Kevin raised his hands to fend off her scowl. "I told you. We have to find the keeper for that, unless you want to warp straight into a gravity well. I did warn you, didn't I?" He had warned them. Nate could still picture Kevin's dubious frown when Nate told the little group where he wanted to go. Kevin had been the only member of their party who actually knew how to reach the Veil of Mysteries, having been born in the hidden star system at its core. But as he told Nate, getting through the Veil was impossible without Taron Galton, the Keeper of the Mysteries. Nate had met the Keeper briefly, a month before, shortly after he first appeared in the Aurora Galaxy. The Keeper had imprinted Nate with a great schemic to guide his use of Energemetra 6 and give him the Sigil of Mysteries, a powerful Energemetra 6 artifact laid aside for Nate by Paul Casisia nearly 1,000 years before. The Keeper was practically family to John and Rachel Casisia, Nate's first friends in the Aurora Galaxy, who'd accompanied the Keeper back to the Veil of Mysteries while Nate went with Drake Loridan to the Telestry. Unfortunately, the only way Kevin knew to contact the Keeper was through agents and star systems near the Veil. It could be months before he responded. They would still have been in Casisia City, arguing about what to do, except that their pre-departure argument had been cut short by Shauna Logan insisting, with a haunted look in her eye, that it was time to go. As her brother Andrew explained, after ordering everyone to strap in,
When Shauna gets one of her feelings, and we ignore it, somebody dies.
Kevin rapidly provided confirmation by means of a terse report from one of his contacts. Dominion guests were expected at the Telestry, in short order. Adamant left immediately, without even taking time to sell the bulk of the salvage they'd gathered from Resolute, Adamant's sister ship. Dubiously, Kevin had pointed them in the direction of the Veil of Mysteries with repeated warnings that it was completely impenetrable. Completely impenetrable. That left them, a day later, staring at the massive, impossibly dense nebula, arguing among themselves once again. After they activated Adamant's Retin drive and the immersion... Wow. After they activated... Okay, doing this with a straight face. After they activated Adamant's Retin drive and the inertial sump's gravity stabilized, allowing them to walk around, Ty and Kevin both expressed their relief that the ship actually had artificial gravity, which drew a snort from Shannon along with a sardonic,
"Oh, you think we're savages?"
Her terse instruction to go sleep while they traveled evoked a shocked stare from Ty, along with Kevin's assurance that it would take at least a week to reach their destination, and it might give them a chance to figure out how to get in. Shannon had laughed at them, claiming the trip would take a maximum of 15 hours if she didn't cut through the edge of the abyss. Now, with a cloud before them, Kevin returned Shannon's stink eye with an annoyed look of his own. A tense moment passed before Shannon sighed peevishly.
"I'm going to sleep. Shauna, you take the helm."
She shot another glance at Kevin and grumbled,
"If you figure anything out, you can wake me. Whatever you do, don't go in without me."
As she rose to leave, Nate held up a hand to stop her, frowning thoughtfully at the dark cloud, while his other hand absent-mindedly fingered the Sigil of Mysteries hanging around his neck. "I think maybe we should go in there." He turned to Shauna, who had settled into her own control station. "How far could we get and still get back out safely again?" Shauna shrugged and was about to respond when Kevin shook his head, almost angrily this time. "You can't do that. It's impossible to navigate. They say it shouldn't even exist. The whole abyssal veil defies the laws of physics. The dust's so thick, sensors can't see more than a light minute, except in spots next to stars where it's cleared out. Our eyes will only show us maybe a unit or so." Shauna was frowning, and she shook her head slowly.
"That's more than 30 light years across. How do we navigate?" How do we even tell where the stars are in there?
Kevin turned to her in obvious relief. You don't. Not normally. For us? He shrugged. It's like a great big dust cloud with gravity balls all over it that'll kill us if we get too close to them. Finding anything inside is practically impossible. You can't orient. The veil was made to stop anybody getting in. Only the keeper knows how to do it. Either we get his help or we point in the right direction and hope real hard, then probably die anyway. He shook his head and glanced dubiously over at Nate. Unless Nate has any bright ideas. Nate didn't respond immediately, frowning at the veil and continuing to stroke the sigil absently. Eventually, Laura Gilvers asked,
How far in could we go without getting lost? If we knew the coordinates of our destination, could we just point it in the right direction and go straight there?
In the 2 days since they had rescued her from Adamant's sister ship, Resolute, Laura had recovered remarkably. Her cheeks no longer looked sunken, her skin had regained a healthy shade of pink, and her voice was strong. The only obvious sign of her nearly month-long imprisonment was her unwillingness to be alone, even while she slept. She had been bunking in Shannon's cabin thus far and showed no desire to speak of what happened aboard Resolute before they found her. None of them could blame her, and they all saw the tension around her eyes when she thought no one noticed. That tension relaxed when she looked at Nate, presumably because he had faced and destroyed the Changed that held her captive and murdered her family. Killing a Changed was a rare feat, but no one had ever banished the shade that controlled one before Nate had. But no one had ever banished the shade that controlled one before. Nate had. Kevin shook his head in response to her question, tossing his universal positioning tool back and forth from one hand to the other. It all moves. Can't tell you why or how, but you can't just aim for Sanctuary and go straight in. Space isn't flat in there. Andrew looked at Nate levelly.
Brightstar, are you sure you want to do this?
Nate returned his gaze and nodded slowly. I think we have to. Andrew nodded back.
You haven't steered us wrong yet. Go ahead, Shauna.
Nate shot Andrew a wry look, but he didn't countermand the order. When they passed into the edge of the great cloud, space behind them lit up in a brilliant reddish hue, fracturing into a rainbow of color around every light source. Ty grinned.
Well,
No. Get your face close to the mic. There you go. Now do it.
well, it's
Scenic.
scenic. Well, it's scenic, isn't it?
After 10 minutes had passed, Shauna turned to Nate worriedly.
You have to tell me what you want me to do now. If we go any further, I have no way of navigating at all. Kevin's right. Everything's moving around. I can hardly tell which way we came from.
They all stared ahead in silence at the featureless brown mass of dust for another long minute. Then Nate laughed aloud. When everyone turned to stare at him, he shook his head, still chuckling. After a moment, he reached inside his shirt and pulled out the Sigil of Mysteries. Then, with the chains still around his neck, he released the sigil. Instead of falling straight down toward the floor, it fell straight toward the window in front of them, bouncing slightly as the fine chain went taut. Nate turned back to Shauna and raised an eyebrow. The Keeper answered the question for us, it looks like. It's a bit unconventional. I don't have much doubt where it's pointing, though. Think you can follow it? Shauna smiled and shook her head.
Dead reckoning would be better than that. At least I can guess at a heading, maybe.
Nate nodded thoughtfully and opened his mouth to speak, but Shannon was staring at the sigil, and she asked,
Can you make it send out a beam of light? Right out to the tip?
Nate glanced over at her and smiled at the sparkle of excitement in her eyes. I think so. He concentrated, and almost at once a brilliant, hand-sized patch of glare sprang into being on the main window where the pendant was pointing.
Ha!
Shannon jumped up from the seat she'd been in at the back of the bridge and hurried to her console. A moment later, she looked at Nate and asked,
Can you make the beam any smaller?
"How small would you like it?" He raised his eyebrows, still smiling.
However small you can manage without losing intensity.
She didn't look up from her console. As he concentrated and shrank the bright spot from the size of his palm to something about as small as the head of a pin, the brightness actually increased.
That'll do fine.
Shannon said, then a moment later added,
Everyone close your eyes.
Everyone except Ty must have done as she asked, because he was the only one who yowled.
Ow!
Shauna's resulting giggle was contagious, and everyone else started chuckling too. Kevin opened his eyes when he laughed, as evidenced by his own similar exclamation. "Void, Shan! I'm going to be blinking away sports for a week!" Shannon snorted.
Warned you.
Then, after a bit more grumbling, she added,
Okay, you can open your eyes now. Nobody stand up while you're staring at the window, though.
When his eyes opened, Nate couldn't see anything had changed at first. Then he glanced behind him. A brilliant tracery of lines crisscrossed the back wall of the bridge.
Nate, we need you to hang your sigil right there.
Shannon pointed at a spot about an arm's length above the backs of the seats. It was the brightest point on the wall where the spiderweb of light came together to a single clear convergence. He stared thoughtfully at the spot. Pretty sure it doesn't work unless I'm wearing it. It didn't. Nate tried taking the amulet off, and as soon as he released the chain, it became a dim crystal, obeying the ship's gravity as everything else did. After some experimentation, they discovered that what worked best was simply to have Nate hold the chain at the correct point and allow the pendant to fall backward toward the window. After some experimentation, they discovered that what worked best was simply to have Nate hold the chain at the correct point and allow the pendant to fall toward the window, causing the light from the gem to point their way forward. Shannon turned to Shauna.
I've set it up, sis. You'll have to adjust your heading by where the light is hitting the window. But this will get us close. The photo filters in the window can read the gem's light, and it'll give you a heading and... how do you say that?
Declination.
Okay. The photo filters in the window can read the gem's light, and it'll give you a heading and declination.
She smiled in a self-satisfied way. Shauna spent a few minutes adjusting their course until the light from Nate's amulet pointed steadily toward the exact center of the window, well above their heads. Meanwhile, Nate found his arms were tiring rapidly. After holding the pendant in precisely the same position for almost 10 minutes, Nate asked, "Could we take readings or something? I'm not sure how long I can hold this, but I'm sure the trip's going to take a while." Shannon shrugged.
It's set to read all the time, but you should only need to hold it up there when Sis tells you to.
Shauna glanced back at Nate and nodded.
Let's check it every 10 minutes for now.
She turned to Andrew.
How fast should I go?
Andrew shook his head. He looked at Kevin.
How far out does the dust clear from these stars?
Kevin tapped his chin with his UPT. Maybe a light hour, maybe more. Depends. Andrew grimaced.
Not much.
He shook his head again.
We need more than 3 seconds to see a star coming at us. And in that soup, we're going to be making one monster of a bow wave.
Shauna frowned thoughtfully.
You're right, but what if we can make that work for us?
Andrew frowned back, but cocked his head questioningly.
What do you mean?
Shauna was already busy at work.
We can set it up for feedback. The more dust we burn, the faster we can go. Should slow us down in time if we run into any clear areas.
Shauna got quiet for a moment, then said,
Remember? Dad told us the Retin drive actually feeds on space junk.
She smiled, her face sad in a distant way, but still focused on her task.
How long will it take to get us there? How long will it take to get us there?
Read the sentence again. What does it say? How long?
How long will it take us to get there?
Ty asked.
Depends on how far into this muck we have to go.
Andrew replied, looking at Kevin questioningly. Kevin shrugged. Most of the time, Sanctuary's within a couple light years of the Vale Center. Usually. Remember, space isn't flat in there. Andrew shook his head.
Going to take at least a day or two. Even with Shauna's trick. If we push too hard, we're toast. We can only stop so fast.
It turned out that crossing the Vale was supremely dull for anyone not in the navigator's seat. For Shauna, then Andrew, then Shannon after she'd slept, the trip was nerve-wracking. The constant laser focus with which they had to watch the instruments, darting their eyes to the forward view from time to time to look for any break or slackening in the muck, left them exhausted after only an hour or two. The fact that such care was necessary was never visually obvious to those who watched from the back of the bridge, because the view of their meteoric bow wave, plowing a short-lived tunnel of light through the muddy blackness outside, never changed. Because they had to take turns navigating, they knew the trip would take several days. Andrew quickly put together a watch rotation. They ran Adamant on a 24-hour day, a fact no one remarked on until most of the group was getting ready to head for the galley for food. In a puzzled voice, Ty asked,
I thought you were from the Milky Way. What schedule do you... I thought you were from the Milky Way. What schedule do ships there run?
Andrew blinked, surprised. Then he chuckled.
Earth has a 24-hour day, so that's what everyone's always used. Why? Did New Standard Time take its 24-hour day from somewhere else?
Oh, I don't know.
Ty looked shocked, as if Andrew's simple question had blown his mind. Andrew shrugged and made a face.
10 days a week are strange. We've always just
10-day
used...
weeks.
10-day weeks are strange. We've always just used the Earth calendar. Granted, that makes leap years feel pointless out in space.
He paused and shook his head.
When we came here, we couldn't change over either. The ship was built to run on Earth time.
Earth has leap days too?
Ty looked somehow triumphant, as if the revelation vindicated him in some strange way. Kevin was looking at Ty with a knowing smirk. You gotta think the first settlers just kept doing things like they were used to, right? It's a wonder we got simple 10s for weeks and months instead of just keeping Earth or Eteria's calendar. Ty looked thoughtful.
How long is your...
How long is an Earth year?
How long is an Earth year?
Try it again. How long is an Earth year?
How long is an Earth year?
365 days.
Shauna said, her eyes fixed firmly on the main window as she was still navigating.
I gather your years are 1,000 days. That means I'm only what, 7?
She made a half-amused, half-disgusted sound.
So that means you're 21 Earth years?
Ty asked.
You don't look more than about 4 or 5.
He blinked.
Is that 12? 15? 100 years here? Is 300 Earth time?
Say that sentence again.
15? 100 Earth years?
No. 100 years here.
100 years here is 300 Earth time?
Shannon snorted.
We've always aged slow. Nobody knows why.
Ty got quiet. After a pause, he nodded.
Yeah, me too.
Do that one more time.
Yeah, me too.
Kevin's wry humor floated back to them as he followed Andrew out of the hatch, looking for food. We're all odds, every one of us. Hadn't you guessed? None of us age normally. 12 hours after their journey had begun, disaster nearly took them. Shannon was navigating, her concentration already taking an obvious toll, with Nate sitting directly behind her along the back wall. Ty was off to Shannon's left, so Nate missed the beginning of their conversation. But when Ty said,
Stupid way to do this.
it caught Nate's attention. Shannon, obviously on edge from focusing constantly on the path ahead, turned to snap back just as Ty reached for her control panel, obviously intent on fixing whatever issue he thought he saw.
What do you think you're...
Shannon's voice was outraged. Just then, the clouds ahead broke apart and a dim, glowing orb swallowed the left side of their forward window. Before they could react, it was already gone, racing past them so close it took Nate's breath away. Shannon turned back in time to see it, and without finishing her sentence, she returned to her navigation, gulping audibly. Ty froze, his fingers still touching the surface of Shannon's control board. It took Nate a moment to fully process what had happened. Once it sank in, he turned to Ty, fire in his eyes. "Are you trying to kill us?" Ty gawped at him, then closed his mouth and shook his head. "Were you actually trying to change something on her system?" Nate asked. "Besides which, if she doesn't focus, we're dead." Ty winced and hunched his shoulders, still silent. Nate stopped very still, staring, then said tightly, "Ty, is this really how you want to act? Like an 8-year-old? You constantly play the kid brother. I know you don't look it, but you're more than 20 years old. You told me so yourself. Is this really who you are?" Ty just looked at Nate for a long moment. Then he opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Nate shook his head. "You are who you choose to be, even more than who... You are who you choose to be, even more than you are what other people see in you." Nate stopped again, then he said quietly, "Stay off the bridge, Ty, unless you can be helpful." Ty nodded and fled. Shannon remained silent, her eyes glued to the window. After that, everyone on the bridge kept their eyes glued to the window. After that, everyone on the bridge kept their eyes glued to the window, and Andrew, Shannon, or Shauna sat with a hand hovering over an emergency stop on the console. As the hours dragged on, Nate and the others felt more and more useless, until 16 hours after they'd entered the Vale, Laura suggested that they take turns sitting at another control station to provide a second pair of eyes. Nate and Kevin quickly agreed. After he was told about it, Ty too begged to take a turn. They all tired quickly. Sitting watching the window with nothing to do while they imagined instant death flashing toward them had a nerve-wracking quality all its own. Only Nate seemed to enjoy being on the bridge. For some reason, the ship's fiery bow wave, showing up as a bright haze outside the window, and the surrounding Vale, soothed him. The tension and difficulty that had so closely attended his time at the Acrolucum, the Telestry School for Young Energemetrists, and the trauma of his battle with the Changed, turned quickly into a strange peace. Even when Nate used his ability to see Energemetra 6, the power that underlay the universe, the dust outside was a homogeneous blur. The ship around Nate was blindingly clear, just as he had come to expect from his Energemetra 6 perceptions, and he could focus on any detail to understand everything completely, down to a molecular level. Outside, though, the dust seemed a blur, its individual particles difficult to pick out in the haze. Once or twice, Nate thought he felt something else on the very edge of his perception, but when he tried to focus on it, the feeling melted away. The Vale seemed like home to him somehow, despite its dreariness, and it left him in a contemplative, strangely relaxed mood. Because he had to check their heading, at first every 10 minutes, then after they determined they were staying on roughly the correct course, every hour or so. Nate napped at the back of the bridge instead of going to the compartment Andrew had assigned him. After he'd gotten a few hours of sleep, interrupted so he could help adjust their course with the sigil, Nate finally went to find food himself. The ship's galley was a short walk around Adamant's radius, in the direction away from the airlock. He admired the greenery growing on the inside arc of the corridor as he walked. Somehow, the contrast between the Vale outside and the white corridor wall, covered in greenery, gave him a near-perfect mental balance. Adamant had been created by people who spent most of their time in space, and it definitely showed. The galley opened off the corridor to Nate's left, and it wasn't nearly as big as Nate had expected. There were only seats for 8 people total, and they all could have stood around the interior easily if Shauna and Kevin weren't currently on watch together. Andrew, Shannon, Laura, and Ty were already seated, with Ty in the furthest seat from Shannon he could get. Ty was subdued, his normal cheerfulness in abeyance, but he still smiled when Nate greeted him. Shannon, too, was friendly enough toward Nate. On the other hand, she was refusing to look at Ty at all. Andrew motioned to a dish sitting on the counter near where Nate had walked in.
Help yourself. It's some kind of Help yourself. It's some kind of melon, I think. That's the last of what we picked up on Eteria. Other than that, all we have left is fruit and other produce from Shauna's garden. It'd be enough to keep us going, but it gets old fast.
Nate nodded, grabbing a plate from a rack on one wall and serving himself. As he sat down, he realized Shannon had been waiting for him. She looked up with fire in her eyes and pointed at Ty.
He has no judgment or discipline. He nearly got us all killed yesterday. Carl Winton or Dad would space anybody who did what he did.
The whole group was silent, with Laura staring at Shannon in shock. Andrew shot Nate a questioning look, as if to ask whether he should step in. But Nate shook his head minutely, and Andrew held his tongue. Neither Ty nor Shannon seemed to notice. After a long silence, Ty spoke up.
I'm really sorry.
No, I'm really sorry. It's not.
I'm really sorry. I won't do anything like that again.
You never should have done it in the first place.
Shannon said, real vitriol in her voice, then added,
And you really shouldn't have been there anyway.
She shot a half-embarrassed look at Nate, but scowled at Ty all the harder. Ty looked at Nate miserably, but his somber, weary nod looked almost comical on an 8-year-old's face as he said,
I shouldn't have done it. I'm sorry, Shannon.
He got up awkwardly then and left the table, heading out the way they'd come. The rest of the group was silent for a long time. Shannon had actually started to fidget before Nate said softly, Shannon, you're going to have to decide what you want more. Do you want to get rid of Ty or to keep me? I don't throw people away because they mess up. He smiled crookedly. And that goes for you too, you know. Shannon nodded in acknowledgement, and Laura, looking uncomfortable, tried to change the subject. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, thought I unmuted it. I like your corridor garden. It has so much more variety than ours did, even though I think ours was bigger.
Andrew smiled.
Shauna has a real green thumb. She's anima attuned, and she has a knack with plants. There'd be no way to keep so many kinds healthy without her.
Laura looked over at Shannon, frowning.
What's your attunement? I don't think you've ever told me. Not like we were close, really, but...
She shrugged. Shannon gave a rare smile.
Pyric. Thankfully, I've got a useful specialty. I've always liked engines. That's where I learned how to do engineering stuff. I'm not exactly a geotic, but I can get by.
Andrew nodded.
I don't know what we'd have done without her. Dad was a geotic, and he taught her a lot before.
His lips twisted, and he shrugged.
I'm nephilic. Not sure what I'd have a talent for. Never had any particular knacks. Guess people listen to me sometimes.
Laura nodded back with a sad, sympathetic smile.
I'm aqueous.
She looked uncomfortable, but after a moment she blurted,
I've got a talent for psi.
Andrew whistled, and Shannon frowned. Laura hurried on.
I never developed it, but that's how I called to Nate when you all came to the Resolute.
Nate's mind flashed back to the experience, the eerie feeling of being drawn onward into the belly of the crashed derelict, and he realized that answered a question that had tickled the back of his mind ever since. Then they were all staring at him, and he blinked. I don't know. Shannon snorted.
He's Amethyst. He's Amethyst-Sana. Is that right?
Amasthena.
Okay. He's Amasthena. Guess it shouldn't be surprised if he's got a talent for everything and anything. Start that over. Guess it shouldn't be a surprise if he's got a talent for anything and everything.
The other two nodded, and Nate shrugged with a grimace. If I did, I wouldn't know it. I still can't remember. They were rising to leave the galley when Shannon stopped Nate as the other two walked out, her eyes downcast.
I'm sorry, too.
She said.
I was angry with him, and he's so...
Nate smiled at her gently. Obnoxious? Shannon nodded agreement, smiling crookedly herself and shrugging. And that ends chapter 1 of The Veil of Mysteries, and thank you for being here, everybody, all of our listeners. Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Mel. Thank you, second and third. You both did good, and I guess we'll catch everybody next week.